The ballroom at Ashcroft House had never been designed for women like Josephine Hartley. It had been built for diamonds, for satins that caught the candlelight and held it, for the rustle of gowns that cost more than a year of her father's modest living. The chandeliers overhead burned with the confidence of people who had never once questioned whether they belonged beneath them. Josephine stood at the edge of the room in her mother's recut silk, ivory gone faintly cream, with careful laundering, and she was quite sure she was invisible. She had told herself this was acceptable. She had told herself she would watch, take her tea at the edge of the room with Mrs. Fairfax, the distant connection who had secured her the invitation, and depart quietly before the dancing began in earnest. She had not anticipated being noticed by Edmund Ashcroft, Duke of Renfield, whose gaze moved through the room with the steady impersonality of a surveyor measuring land he already owned. What she did not yet know was that the brief moment of his attention, delivered with an authority so quiet it required no raised voice, would be the thing that remade her life entirely. To understand how she arrived at that ballroom, and what she carried away from it, it is necessary to go back to the weeks before the season began. Josephine was 23 years old. She had been educated by a father who believed firmly that a mind was a mind regardless of the body that housed it, and who had filled 2 sets of bookshelves with history, philosophy, and agricultural theory before the winter fever took him, leaving his daughter with an understanding of crop rotation and Roman governance and almost nothing else of practical value. The house in Shropshire had passed by entail to a male cousin who had the grace to be embarrassed about it and the convenience to be away when Josephine packed her trunks. Her mother had died 3 years before her father, quietly and without complaint, leaving behind a small sum from the sale of her own family's plate and linens, a habit of neat handwriting, and a single letter addressed to Josephine in an envelope sealed with plain wax, instructing her not to open it unless the world had become genuinely impossible. £4,000. That was what remained after the estate solicitor, a dry and dutiful man named Mr. Pratt, who had served her father for 20 years, had tallied the sum and set it into a trust. £4,000, which was enough to live very carefully for several years, or enough, Josephine suspected, to do something else entirely, though she had not yet determined what that something else might be. London had been Mrs. Fairfax's idea, a season, she had said, or the edge of one, enough to be seen without the expense of a true debut. Josephine had packed her mother's recut silk and told herself she expected nothing. The ball was in the 3rd week of April. The rooms were crowded with the particular density of a gathering that had assembled itself precisely to be seen, and Josephine moved through it with the careful stillness of someone who has learned that the surest way to avoid a collision is to remain against the wall. She had been standing near a marble pillar for perhaps 40 minutes, a glass of ratafia untouched in her gloved hand, when Mrs. Fairfax appeared at her shoulder with a look of determined sociability, and steered her toward a small cluster of guests gathered near the terrace doors. Edmund Ashcroft stood with 2 men Josephine did not know, and a woman with diamonds enough to qualify as a chandelier herself. He was taller than she had expected from Mrs. Fairfax's descriptions, and colder in the face, with the kind of stillness that does not come from calm, but from the long practice of suppressing everything that is not calm. His jaw was sharp, his brows dark, his eyes the particular gray of clouds that have not yet decided whether to storm. He did not look at Josephine when Mrs. Fairfax introduced her. He looked, rather, at the middle distance just past her left shoulder, in the way of a man who has learned to make absence into courtesy. "Miss Hartley," Mrs. Fairfax said, with the brightness of someone who has made a wager on a horse of uncertain temperament. "Josephine Hartley, of the Shropshire Hartleys." One of the men nodded. The woman with the diamond smiled with the precision of someone who has practiced smiling until it contained no warmth at all. Edmund Ashcroft looked, finally, at Josephine, and his gaze was a form of measuring, quick and complete, the kind that catalogued cloth and carriage in a single pass and filed the conclusion somewhere it would not trouble him. "Miss Hartley," he said with the measured flatness of a man who saw no reason to inflect the greeting. Then, before Mrs. Fairfax could direct the conversation toward anything easier, he said, very quietly and without particular emphasis, "You have strayed rather far from the receiving line. These rooms are for the Ashcroft guests this evening. I would ask you to know your place." Mrs. Fairfax made a small, distressed sound. The woman with the diamonds looked away, suddenly interested in the candles. One of the men studied the floor. Josephine Hartley was not a woman who shouted. She had been raised not to shout, had been shaped by years of constraint into the very neat, very quiet management of every feeling that might otherwise embarrass her in public. She felt the words land in the center of her chest, like something cold poured carefully from a height, and she held perfectly still while the cold spread. Then she curtsied. It was a correct curtsy, neither too deep nor too shallow, performed with the unhurried composure of a woman who had nothing to prove and no one to prove it to. She set her untouched ratafia on the small table beside her and walked out of the receiving rooms and through the entrance hall and down the stone steps into the spring night, where the carriages were waiting and the air smelled of coal smoke and early daffodils. She did not cry. She had cried for her father's house. She had cried for her mother's empty chair. She had no tears left to assign to a man she had met for less than 3 minutes. What she had, instead, was £4,000 and Mr. Pratt. She called on Silas Pratt the following morning at his offices in Gray's Inn, arriving at 9:30 in a cab she paid for herself. He was a small, careful man, with ink-stained fingers and a complete absence of imagination, which Josephine had always found reassuring. He received her in the outer office because she had no appointment, and when she explained what she wanted, he was quiet for a long moment. "You wish to purchase property," he said. "I wish to purchase a specific property," Josephine said, "adjoining the Renfield estate in Wiltshire, the one the estate agents have been advertising for the better part of 2 seasons. Thornfield Grange." Mr. Pratt removed his spectacles, polished them with a cloth from his waistcoat pocket, and replaced them. "The seller is motivated," he said at last. "The property is 90 acres, most of it workable. The house itself in moderate disrepair. The asking price is £4,000, though I am confident, given the property's history and the seller's circumstances, that a skilled negotiation would deliver it for rather less." "Deliver it," Josephine said, "for £3,800. Mr. Pratt made a notation. He did not ask why she wanted a property in Wiltshire, and she did not explain, which was one of the things she had always valued about him. The transaction was, in its essentials, very simple. She was a fame soul, unmarried and of age, with full legal standing to purchase and hold property in her own name. The money was hers. The decision was hers. She signed the first papers 3 days later, in that same outer office, with the smell of coal smoke coming through the window and the sound of clerks moving in the rooms above. Agnes Hartley's letter, which she had carried in her coat pocket since leaving Shropshire, sat inside the inner envelope she had opened the night before. The instructions had been brief. Do not waste it on another person's comfort when you need comfort yourself. Her mother had always been more direct than anyone gave her credit for. Josephine tucked the empty envelope back into her pocket and signed her name in a clear, even hand. Thornfield Grange came into her possession on the 14th of May, at a final purchase price of £3,800 exactly, leaving her with £200 for the immediate costs of occupation and modest improvement. Mr. Pratt drove with her in the hired carriage to confirm the transfer and to meet with the outgoing steward, a weathered man named Jessup, who had stayed on through 3 changes of ownership, and who looked at Josephine with the particular expression of a man recalibrating every assumption he had walked in with. The house was worse than the estate agent's description had suggested. The east wing's roof showed its age through 2 rooms with damp patches on the plaster. The kitchen range needed attention, and the hedgerow along the western boundary, which formed the quarter-mile of shared edge between Thornfield and Renfield Park, had grown so tall and tangled that it blocked half the light from the kitchen garden. The parkland itself, 90 acres of it, was overgrown in the way of land that has been ignored rather than ruined, and a morning's walk revealed that the soil was good, the drainage adequate, and the timber stands healthy. Josephine walked the boundary hedgerow on her second morning. She walked all 400 yards of it, noting where the old fence posts had rotted through and where the ditch on the Renfield side had silted up and begun to back water onto her side of the line. She made notes in a small book she carried for the purpose and returned to the house with her hem wet and her mind already calculating what the first season's improvement would require. If you have been listening closely and find yourself curious about what Edmund Ashcroft made of his new neighbor, stay with the story. The answer arrives slowly, as such things do, and it is worth waiting for. She was installed at Thornfield for 6 weeks before she encountered him directly. She had seen Renfield Park from a distance, its roofline visible above the hedgerow on clear days, its grounds maintained with the impersonal precision of a property cared for by people who are paid to care for it, rather than by anyone who loves it. She had received, at the end of her 3rd week, a brief note delivered by a liveried footman, written in a hand that was educated and severe, informing her that the boundary ditch as maintained from the Renfield side was adequate to the existing easement, and that any proposed alterations on the Thornfield side would need to be submitted in writing to the estate office before being undertaken. The note was not signed with a first name. It was signed with the single word Renfield, below which there was a ducal seal pressed into dark wax. Josephine read the note twice, filed it in the writing desk drawer, and requested a meeting with Jessup to discuss the ditch's actual drainage history. Whatever Edmund Ashcroft had decided about her, the ditch required attention regardless. The boundary dispute, such as it was, came to a head in the 3rd week of June, when Josephine's men began clearing the silted section of the ditch along the Thornfield side, and a rider from Renfield appeared at the gate to inform her that the work was within disputed boundary territory, and the Duke expected to speak with the owner of the property in person. She received him in the front parlor, which she had stripped of its previous owner's accumulated clutter and furnished with her mother's writing desk, 2 sensible chairs, and a bookcase she had brought from storage at the Shropshire House. The room was neat and plain and entirely functional, and she sat in it with her hands folded in her lap and waited. Edmund Ashcroft arrived without ceremony, and with an expression that suggested he had not prepared himself for the specific obstacle she represented. He stood in the doorway for a fraction of a second, long enough for Josephine to note the precise quality of the pause, before he moved into the room and took the offered chair with the economy of motion of a man who regards sitting down as a necessary concession. "Miss Hartley," he said. "Your Grace," she said. There was a silence in which the quality of his looking changed. He had the look of a man reaching for a categorization and finding it absent, which she recognized because she had spent her life being miscategorized and knew the expression from the inside. "The ditch work," he said. "The eastern section of the boundary runs directly through the drainage easement registered to Renfield in 1794. The eastern section of the boundary," Josephine said, with a quietness she had learned to make into armor, "sits 3 yards inside the Thornfield survey line as registered in the last proper measurement, which was conducted in 1802 and which Mr. Pratt has the original records of, if your Grace's estate office requires them. He was still for a moment. His hands, she noticed, rested flat on his knees with the deliberate steadiness of a man who controls his hands when he does not know what else to do. "You have already consulted the records," he said. "I consulted them before I signed the purchase agreement," she said. It seemed prudent. Another silence. Longer. She watched him revise something internally, some preliminary judgment he had arrived with, and she felt the small, cold satisfaction of having been prepared when preparation was the only weapon available to her. He left the parlor without resolving the question of the ditch, which resolved itself naturally when Jessup confirmed that her survey line was correct, and Renfield's estate manager had the grace to send a written acknowledgment of the same within a fortnight. But he came back. He came back to dispute the placement of a fence post at the northern end of the boundary, and then again over the question of shared water rights from the stream that crossed the lower field. And each time Josephine received him in the front parlor with the same quiet preparedness, and each time she noticed, without permitting herself to name it, that his gaze remained on her face a moment longer than the question before him required. It was on his third visit, in the first days of August, that he arrived unannounced and found her in the east kitchen garden, not in the parlor. She was speaking, with considerable firmness, to a large man she did not know, who had arrived at the kitchen gate with a document he claimed entitled him to remove 4 of the garden's fruit trees, which he said had been promised to a creditor of the property's previous owner. The man was large and very sure of himself, and beside him stood a boy of perhaps 8, a tenant's child from the Thornfield cottages, who had apparently been following Josephine around the garden that morning in the hopeful way of children who have found an adult willing to answer their questions, and who was now standing very still with the tight, frightened expression of a child who does not understand what is happening, but understands that it is bad. Josephine understood immediately that the document was fraudulent, or at minimum that the man presenting it had no legal standing on Thornfield land, and she said so with the calm precision she usually reserved for writing desk correspondence. She named the relevant statute. She named the date of her ownership registration. She asked for the man's full name and the name of his supposed creditor in a tone that made it abundantly clear that she intended to write a letter about both. The man's certainty deflated with the specific speed of a man who had not anticipated being answered in his own legal vocabulary, and he departed through the kitchen gate with the document still in his hand and a great deal less of his original confidence. The boy exhaled. Josephine turned to find Edmund Ashcroft standing at the garden wall, 8 feet away, with an expression she had never seen on his face in any of their previous meetings. He was not calculating. He was not measuring. He was simply watching her, and the quality of his attention had the specific weight of a man who has seen something he did not expect and cannot yet account for. He did not speak immediately. She waited. "The boy is Thomas Crane's son," he said at last. "From the South Cottage." "I know," Josephine said. "He has been helping me identify the apple varieties. He knows a Ribston Pippin from a nonpareil at 15 yards, which is more than the previous steward could apparently manage." Something moved across Edmund Ashcroft's face. Something so controlled and so quickly settled that she might have missed it entirely if she had not been paying attention. "Come inside," he said. Not to her. To the boy. The boy looked at Josephine. She nodded. The boy went. Edmund remained at the garden wall for a moment, looking at the kitchen gate where the man had departed, and Josephine had the strange sense that he was deciding something, not about the gate or the trees or the fraudulent document, but about something that had been waiting much longer than that. He said nothing further, and she did not press him. He was still working something out, and she had learned, from years of being dismissed, the patience to wait. What he was working out, though she did not know it yet, had its roots in a grief he had spent 6 years keeping perfectly still. His first wife had been called Caroline. She had been 21 years old when they married, the daughter of a neighboring earl, selected with the same impersonal efficiency he had applied to every other administrative decision of his inheritance. He had not been unkind to her. He had been cold, which is a different thing, and sometimes a worse one. Caroline Ashcroft had spent the last months of her pregnancy trying to reach her husband across a distance he maintained not from cruelty, but from the particular cowardice of a man who cannot let himself love something he is afraid to lose. She had died in the spring of the child's birth, and the child had lived. A son named William, now 5 years old, who had his mother's eyes and his father's unfortunate habit of silence. Edmund had never forgiven himself for the coldness. He had simply added it to the list of things he carried, pressed flat and maintained with the same impersonal efficiency as everything else. He had not expected, in any accounting he had done of his life's future course, a woman who defended tenants in kitchen gardens with reference to specific statutes. He returned to the garden 1 week later, ostensibly about the water rights from the lower field stream, and stayed for an hour longer than the question required. He asked her once about the drainage improvements, and once about the apple varieties, and once, in a question so carefully offhand that it was clearly the one he had actually come to ask, whether she intended to remain at Thornfield through the winter. "I intend to remain indefinitely," Josephine said. "It is my property." "Yes," he said. "I know." She thought about this after he left, standing at the writing desk with the afternoon light coming through the new panes she had had fitted in June. It was not a declaration. It was barely even a sentence. He knew. He had named the fact of it, which was more than she had expected from a man who 6 months earlier had told her to know her place in a London ballroom, and then returned to his diamonds. The shift in her own interior was something she permitted herself to note, and nothing more. She was not a woman who let herself hope carelessly. She had been educated out of that, the way one is educated out of reaching for things on high shelves, when the reaching has produced nothing but scraped fingers often enough. The assembly at Vane House occurred in the 2nd week of September. It was a county gathering, the sort of rural social occasion that filled the gap between the London season and the winter shooting parties, and the guest list was the collected gentry of the district within 12 miles. Josephine attended because she had been invited by Mrs. Harlow, the vicar's wife, who was a sensible and generous woman, and who had decided that the new owner of Thornfield Grange was a person worth knowing. She wore her ivory silk, which she had pressed again, and her mother's pearl earrings, which were small and real. And she went without Mrs. Fairfax, and without any expectation of the evening beyond a cup of tea and the pleasant company of Mrs. Harlow. Lady Dorothea Ashcroft had attended from Wrenfield Park, as she attended every significant gathering within the district, and she had brought with her Miss Cecily Vane, who was the daughter of the house, and was considered by everyone whose opinion Lady Dorothea valued to be exactly the correct kind of young woman for the Duke of Wrenfield's second marriage. Cecily was lovely in the manner of a woman who has never been told she is anything else, with fair hair dressed in the current fashion and a natural ease in rooms that had been built for people like her. She wore blue satin trimmed with silver thread, and she moved through the assembly with the light confidence of a person who has never once had to consider whether she belonged. Josephine saw Lady Dorothea notice her from across the room, and she noted, with the resigned accuracy of a woman who has learned to read such noticing, the precise quality of the Dowager Duchess's assessment. It was a slow, complete, and thoroughly dismissive examination, conducted with the fan held at a particular height, that communicated the conclusion before any words were required. The words came 20 minutes later. Josephine was speaking with Mrs. Harlow near the fireplace when she became aware that the room's texture had changed. Lady Dorothea had moved toward the center of the gathering, where 3 or 4 of the more prominent local families had clustered near the refreshment table, and her voice, pitched with the precision of a woman who understood exactly how far sound traveled, reached Josephine clearly. "The woman in the ivory," the dowager said, with the measured patience of someone naming a social problem for the benefit of people who had not yet understood it, "is a Shropshire gentleman's daughter, without connections, family, or means, unless one counts the rather inexplicable purchase of a neglected property that will be a ruin again inside of 5 years. She has no more claim to standing in this county than the bailiff who collects the rents." "An impostor," she said, and the word landed in the room with the particular weight of a word deployed by someone accustomed to its effects, "and a social climber who would do better to know her place." The phrase dropped the temperature of the room by several degrees. Josephine felt it settle over her the way cold things settle, the specific chill of public reduction, of being named in a room full of people who would rather agree than argue. Mrs. Harlow had gone very still. The vicar, standing 3 feet away, found his teacup suddenly fascinating. Cecily Vane, standing at Lady Dorothea's left hand, looked at Josephine with an expression that was not quite triumph, because it was not quite earned, but was the expression of a woman watching an obstacle removed before she has been required to remove it herself. What Josephine felt was known to her, because she had felt it before. The cold in the chest. The impulse to find the nearest door. The absolute certainty that the dignity of departure was the only dignity available to her. She excused herself from Mrs. Harlow very quietly, walked to the small cloakroom at the back of the house, and stood with her back against the wall for 2 minutes and 3 seconds, which she counted because counting helped. Then she walked back into the assembly room. She had not prepared a speech. She did not believe in speeches, which required an audience already disposed to listen. What she had was the composure of a woman who has decided that the only thing worse than being publicly reduced is allowing the reduction to stand. And she walked back to the fireplace, where Mrs. Harlow still stood with her teacup, and she stood there in her ivory silk with her pearl earrings, and she waited with the specific stillness that is not quietness, but its exact opposite. It was at this point that the room became aware of Edmund Ashcroft. He had been standing near the far wall, which Josephine had not known, though it explained in retrospect why Lady Dorothea had chosen the moment she did. He had been standing with the stillness she recognized as his particular quality, and he had heard every word his mother had said. She watched him cross the room. He did not hurry. He moved with the deliberate, measured pace of a man for whom the crossing of a room is an act he has chosen fully and intends to complete in precisely the manner he has chosen, and the crowd yielded before him with the automatic instinct of people who understand power when it is in motion. His eyes were on Josephine's face, not the refreshment table, not his mother, not Cecily Vane. On Josephine's face, with an expression that was still controlled, still Edmund Ashcroft's particular discipline, but which contained something the discipline could not entirely hold. He stopped before her, and the room had gone to the quality of silence that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of every person in it, holding their breath at once. Lady Dorothea's fan stilled. Cecily Vane had gone very straight. Edmund Ashcroft looked at Josephine for one long moment in which she could feel, against every intention, the specific warmth of being seen. Not catalogued. Not measured. Seen, which was an entirely different sensation, and one she had less experience with than she would have liked. "Miss Hartley," he said, and his voice was level and quiet, and carried the full length of the room. "Permit me to introduce you properly, since it appears the introduction was inadequately performed the first time." He turned then to the room, and the room waited. "Josephine Hartley," he said, "is the owner of Thornfield Grange, and my nearest neighbor. She is a woman of education, of competence, and of a quality of character that this county would benefit from attending to, rather than dismissing." He paused, and the pause was the kind a man makes, not because he has run out of words, but because he has selected the next ones with particular care. "She is also, if she will have me, my intended." The silence held for one more heartbeat. Then the room began, very slowly, to breathe again. Josephine looked at him. He was looking at her with the expression she had seen in the kitchen garden, the one she had not yet known how to name, and now she thought she understood it. It was the expression of a man who has been afraid to reach for something for a long time, and has finally decided that the reaching is worth the risk. Lady Dorothea's voice, when it came, was smaller than it had been. "Edmund," she said. "Mother," he said quietly, and the word contained so much that she did not press further. Cecily Vane turned away, and her face, in the half-second before she completed the turn, held the expression of a woman recognizing that the room she had been certain of had rearranged itself around a fact she had not been given to prepare for. It was not a cruel expression to witness. It was simply the face of someone whose script had ended before she expected. Josephine had not moved. She was aware that the room was watching her, aware of Mrs. Harlowe's small, exhaled breath at her left, aware of the fire warming the side of her face and the weight of her mother's pearls at her ears. She said quietly and without any performance at all, "You told me, once, to know my place, Your Grace." "I did," he said. "I went and found one," she said. Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile. The thing that lives behind a smile in a man who has spent years forgetting where he put it. Suddenly located. "Yes," he said. And his voice had lost the quality of measurement entirely. "You did. If Josephine's story has stayed with you, and if you have ever sat in a room that was not built for you and held perfectly still, leave a word in the comments. The narration returns to Thornfield now, where the story has its proper close. The formal engagement was confirmed by Mr. Pratt before the week was out, the solicitor arriving at Thornfield on a gray Thursday morning with the papers for Josephine's review, and a professional serenity that concealed, she suspected, a certain satisfaction at the tidy conclusion of a matter he had managed with characteristic economy from the first. He stayed for half an hour, drank the tea Jessop's wife pressed on him, and departed with every document in order, and his ink-stained hands clasped behind his back. Edmund came that afternoon, through the kitchen garden gate rather than the front drive, which was a choice she noted without comment. He stood in the parlor with her mother's writing desk between them, and looked at the room with the particular attention of a man cataloging something he intends to return to. "The house is better than it was," he said. "6 months of work," she said. "The roof is sound. The east wing wants attention in the spring." "I will send men," he said. "I have men," she said. He looked at her. The thing behind the almost smile was present again. "You have £200 and a man named Jessop, who is 70 years old," he said. "Jessop has 60 years of knowledge of this soil," she said, "which is worth considerably more than £200. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said at last. "I expect it is." She had thought, in the weeks between, about the question of what it meant to accept a proposal from a man who had begun by dismissing her, and she had turned the question over with the same care she had applied to the drainage survey and the apple tree inventory. He was not a different man from the one who had stood in that ballroom and told her, with the practiced ease of a man who had never needed to consider the weight of his words, to know her place. He was the same man who had been wearing, at that moment, a version of himself assembled for exactly that kind of room, cold and authoritative, and sealed against anything that might require him to feel something inconvenient. She had seen, in the kitchen garden and in the front parlor and across the length of an assembly room, the man beneath that version. She was not foolish enough to think the process of his becoming someone she could trust would be quick or simple. She was not a woman who required it to be. What she required was that it be real. He stayed for an hour. He sat in the chair across from her and asked her, with a careful directness that cost him something she could see, whether she had understood what he had said about Caroline. She had not told him she knew, but he had known that she had guessed from the way he had gone still in the garden the first time she had mentioned William. "I was cold to her," he said. "Not deliberately. I did not understand, at the time, that a person can be destroyed slowly by the careful maintenance of a distance that seems, to the person maintaining it, like self-protection." She looked at him for a long moment. "I understand that particular machinery very well," she said. He looked down at his hands. "I know you do." "William," she said. "Does he know about this?" Edmund looked up, and for a moment the careful discipline was entirely absent. "I told him yesterday that I had a neighbor who could identify 12 apple varieties at 15 yards and who had sent a fraudulent bailiff packing using only statutory law and her own voice. And he asked if she might teach him, he said." Josephine thought about a 5-year-old boy with his mother's eyes sitting at the kitchen garden wall with a Ribston Pippin in his hand, and the thought was warm in a way she had not expected to feel so readily. "I expect she might," she said. He left at dusk, and she stood at the parlor window and watched his horse cross the corner of the park and disappear through the gap in the hedgerow, the quarter-mile of shared boundary that had begun the whole improbable process of their proximity. And she thought about her mother's empty envelope in the writing desk drawer. The first snow came in November. Not the hard winter snow of January, but the tentative early kind. The sort that falls in the afternoon and does not quite commit, settling on the kitchen garden and the hedgerow and the roof of the east wing in a thin pale layer that softened every line. Josephine stood at the parlor window with her morning tea and watched it come down, and the room behind her was warm from the fire she had laid herself, and the writing desk sat in its corner with Agnes Hartley's letter folded inside its drawer. She went to the desk and opened the drawer and took the letter out. Not the empty envelope, the one whose instructions she had followed, but the letter itself, which had been inside the envelope, and which she had read only once, on the night she had come back from Mr. Pratt's office with the first signed papers, and which she had folded away carefully because she had not been ready to carry it yet. Her mother had not written much. Agnes Hartley was not a woman who wasted words on reassurance when practical instruction would serve better. The letter said, in the neat, even hand Josephine knew better than any other handwriting in the world, "You will know what to do with it. You always have. Whatever place you find for yourself, find one that is yours." The snow was still falling. The fire crackled at her back. Somewhere above her, on the upper floor, she had repaired and repainted, and filled with the things she had carried from Shropshire, and the things she had chosen herself. The house made the small, particular sounds of a house that is lived in. She refolded the letter and set it back in the drawer. Not the envelope. The letter itself, which she had found her place to keep. Outside, through the parlor window, the hedgerow between Thornfield and Renfield was visible through the falling snow, its tangled winter outlines softened to something almost gentle. She could see, at the far edge of it, the beginning of the Renfield grounds, and the roofline beyond, and the faint, warm square of a lit window in the afternoon gray. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she went to add another log to the fire, because the room was hers, and it was cold outside, and she had learned, over the course of a year that had begun in a ballroom where she was invisible, that warmth was not a thing one waited for other people to provide. It was a thing one built.